Thank you, Zell, for taping this presentation. And you will send it to me. We will share with Dr. Artz after this. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Artz today, as well as our guests. We have a few guests today in class. Thank you so much for being here, all of you. Thank you, Nancy, for working on this. Oh, we need to push these. Okay. All right. So a couple words about Dr. Artz, and it's going to be incredibly brief and probably not adequate because there is so much to tell. He and I have known each other for about 25 years. Now that we are going to set, like a date to this thing. But we used to be colleagues. Dr. Artz and I came to Loyola invited by an interest of Loyola to promote and create programs that were social justice oriented. So we had a great mutual joy, I think, of being colleagues for a while until he found other possibilities that were more interesting to him elsewhere. He has written over 7 books around issues of media, politics, and mainstream depictions and framing of issues that had to deal with national policy, international policy, national issues, international issues, with a very critical perspective. And he actually has had the opportunity to travel to Venezuela, and his talk today is about the media framing of the Venezuela crisis. And in our social justice class, we were speaking about Latin American issues and different movements, social movements in the United States. And this is really an opportunity, a great opportunity, thank you so much for being here, to go in a little bit more depth into a particular case, a particular country that we all recognize from the news, but we may not know much about it except for a couple sound bites, like Venezuela, oil, evil, a strong man at the head of it. And what Ali is going to do for us is to provide us with the research that he has done that shows what is that's being said about Venezuela, what may not be said about Venezuela, and invite us collectively to think about the implications for situations happening in the continent, in other places. I have invited him to speak for about 30 minutes, and as we usually do in class, after that I will invite you to speak among yourselves and raise issues. You're welcome to question, to comment, to ponder about implications of this. And all of you who are taking the social justice class, my invitation to you, actually assignment, for you is to write a blog on what you are going to listen today. So as always, the blog doesn't need to be long. It will be your response, what you found interesting, what kind of questions this provoke for you. How does that relate to social justice? How does that relate to communication, right? So please write this blog and do it as soon as possible so that things are fresh in your mind. So with nothing more due for now, please do take notes because that will help us understand what's going on. I welcome Dr. Artz to our class and to Loyola University, and this is a little bit of a homecoming back into our university. Thank you for being here.
I don't have a speech so much as several comments that are drawing from some of the things that I've written about and some of the things that I've talked about. And I think the first place to start, there's a slideshow, but it isn't necessarily related to what I'm talking about, but you're all millennials or younger, so you're used to having multiple things coming at you at the same time. But some of the things will be on the slides I will refer to when I'm talking. Again, when Elizabeth was talking, I thought immediately of a song by Chumbawamba called Everything You Know Is Wrong. And there's a big problem with that because how do you know what you know? How does anybody know right now about Venezuela or Yemen or Syria or for that matter the west side of Chicago? If you're not directly there, how do you know? You're going to get it filtered through something, which is usually the media. And here's a problem. In 10 years, from 2005 to 2015, the BBC had 304 stories on Venezuela. 304 stories in 10 years. 3 of those stories talked about what the social changes were in Venezuela. Most people don't know what the changes were. When you're talking about social justice, and social justice isn't just a concept, but it's something that has to be enacted, I would say Venezuela is the most historic opportunity, maybe in the last 100 years. But in general, the American population and the rest of the world doesn't know that. So I wanted to begin with what some of those changes are. As Elizabeth said, I've been to Venezuela a few times. I've been following Venezuela through a variety of sources. When I was in Caracas, the capital city, the thing that struck me most is that the working class and the poor live down in the hillside. In the United States, the rich live up in Beverly Hills or whatever. In Caracas, it's the opposite. I don't know if it's the rich don't want to walk up the hillside, but they don't live there. They live down here. They have condos, they have swimming pools, they have air conditioning. Not everybody, but there's a very clear class divide. I also noted the things that irritate the wealthy. The number of community schools that have been built since Chavez was elected in 1998. The number of community clinics with free health care that have been built since 1998. Number of community radio stations, and I wrote a lot on the community radio, and I will be happy to give anybody citations or references. So if you have questions, please challenge, please object, please say that sucks, I don't care. All of that's good, and I will send you where I'm getting the information. The interesting thing to me was when Chavez was elected in 1998, one of the first things that he did, and he had campaigned on it, is to let the population write the Constitution. There was a constituent assembly that was elected by the population, and then they discussed the Constitution in community groups, in school groups, in union groups, all across the country. And when they were done, they voted on 396 articles, and it was passed by 71% of the population. This new Constitution changed many things. It didn't directly confront the existing institutions that went before. So it wasn't like after Chavez was elected, they closed down the Department of Education or the Department of Trade or the Department of Fishing or anything else. They ran what they called were parallel institutions. The parallel institutions would be run by community councils or labor groups, and those community councils, those councils that were based on about 400 residents, more in urban and rural areas because it was a wider part, but they would decide what they needed for water supply. They would decide how many schools or where the schools needed to go. They would decide who would run the radio and TV station. They would decide sports and parks. So how did they pay for this? And here's the thing that irritated the U.S. and the people that lived in the wealthy gated communities in Venezuela the most, is that 30% of the revenue from oil sales went to what was called a social fund, and that social fund was used to finance community media, used to finance schools, used to finance universities. Some of these things are up here. In the Constitution, several things were passed. I'll just give you a few. Land reform, which limited the amount of land that one person could own to 12,000 acres. Land reform that said if land was idle, it would be given to working farmers. Land reform that in urban areas gave title to people's homes. I wish I would have had a picture of Caracas, but there's hills on the side. And people would build a house, and then somebody would come a couple years later and build a house on top of their house, and then they would build a house on top of their house, and nobody had title to any of that. One of the things that happened in the first 3 years after Chavez was elected, people got titles to their own homes for the very first time. One of the things that the Constitution said is that the value and the resources of Venezuela belong to the Venezuelans. And from that time on, 51% of all joint ventures in Venezuela were owned by the public, by the government. Public benefits from those things, as I said, went to this social fund, and the social fund was used for schools, healthcare, education. A few of these things are, when the slides pass by, you will see. They have 2015, 2016. At that point, they had eliminated illiteracy in Venezuela. The United Nations came and presented a Literacy of the Year award to Venezuela. They had reduced real poverty to, had cut it in half in the first 10 years after Chavez was elected. They also had changed the way that the population made decisions. Before Chavez was elected, it was kind of like the United States. There were two parties, and they were the parties of the elite, essentially. I mean, everybody could vote, but it'd be like Democrats and Republicans. Like, how much say do anybody in this room have over the Democratic or Republican candidates? By the time you go into the voting booth next November, it's already decided who you can or can't vote for. There's not a lot of, right? You don't get to vote on referenda. You don't get to vote on the Constitution. You don't get to vote on whether the U.S. gives money to Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen. You don't get to do that. You get to vote for two candidates, and you got to pick one or the other. And I would argue there's not much difference between either one of them. What happened in Venezuela is that was changed with the Constitution. It meant that these communal councils would make decisions over how the money that was raised from oil sales and mineral deposits and mineral sales was going to be used. And they would have elections. One of the charges that's in the press is that there's the current president, Nicolas Maduro, is illegitimate because the election was fraudulent or there was something wrong with it. The interesting thing for me is Jimmy Carter in the Carter Institute was there and monitoring several elections, and he says of the 92 elections that we've monitored, I would say the process in Venezuela is the best in the world. Forbes magazine, not exactly a mouthpiece for socialism, Forbes magazine said the election process in Venezuela is a model for democratic elections in the world. It's not me saying it, it's not Maduro saying it, it's Forbes saying it. Under the Constitution, women have the right to be paid as carers, which means women that are housekeepers. There's a special women's bank, and the poorest housewives get, well, this was a few years ago, $200 or $300 a month. The thing that I studied the most was radio and television. And in the 15 years up until 2015, Venezuela's radio and television had expanded more than 60%. There's more than 1,200 community radio and television stations. And then there's several hundred more print stations, which is an amazing thing. Again, I would ask you, how many people in here produced a television show last week? Made a movie? Had an article on the local newspaper? We talk about a democratic free press in the United States, but nobody in this room, and I'll bet you nobody that you know, is actually doing the production of what we witnessed. In Venezuela, if you were in Venezuela, in Caracas, you could broadcast on Radio Primero Negro, you could broadcast on 23 Enero in your community. The community would decide what's going to be on the radio. You could go to TV Avela, which is largely run by 20-somethings, and you can produce local video, and that gets broadcast to the entire country. We talk about community radio stations in the United States with the low power FM, and they have a maximum wattage of 100 watts and a maximum reach of 7 miles. There's none in Chicago because the private media in Chicago said that would be too much competition for us. They're all in rural areas. In Venezuela, Primero Negro, 23 Enero, Catilla TV, Avela TV, Vives TV, broadcast to millions, which means the general population actually has access, a right that the UN says, the right to communicate, not just to receive, right? I hope that you're learning in communication at Loyola that communication is not a transmission from one to the other, but it's actually the exchange, the construction, and sharing of ideas. So if you can't make your own media, where is the democracy? If you're reduced to only choosing the choices that somebody else gives you, where is the democracy? And again, I'm not saying this, but the CIA, and I can give you the citation, the CIA says the social investments in Venezuela during the Chavez administration reduced poverty from 50% to about 25% in 2011, and it went lower than that. Also, eradicated illiteracy, created a national system guaranteeing free health care, subsidized food program, a program of free and affordable housing to the poor and middle class, subsidies to housewives for the domestic work, and a pension program. That's what the CIA said about Chavez. How many people read that in the newspaper? You don't know that. All you know is how the media is framing that. I would say none of that's really that important as far as the United States is concerned, the specific details. Nor is it of issue with the United States or most oil companies in the United States if a country nationalizes its oil. Because Saudi Arabia has a nationalized oil system. The difference is in Saudi Arabia, the profits are shared with Aramco and BP and Exxon and of course the feudal lords, right? But when they nationalized oil production in Venezuela, that money went to the population, which is not acceptable. I say the biggest threat here is the threat of a good example. A threat of a good example. And neither the capitalist class, nor the major media, nor the major private industries in Venezuela accepted this. Even though their income went up, their standard of living went up through the 15 years of Chavez's presidency, but they never accepted it. And how do we know that? Because there was a coup in 2002. The head of the Chamber of Commerce, the head of RCTV, the head of the business union for PDVSA, which is the oil company, they went to Miraflores, where the president was. They took the president, kidnapped him, put him on a helicopter, and flew him to an island. They dissolved the National Assembly. They closed down all the community radio and TV stations. They said the Constitution that was passed no longer exists, and they declared themselves the leaders of the country. Two nations recognized them. Israel was one. What was the other one? The U.S. The New York Times ran an editorial that says, "Hooray, now democracy can be restored." Seriously? The man that just got 70% of the ballot was kidnapped, flown to an island, and they declared the Constitution and freedom of speech, freedom of press, no longer. That didn't last, because people by 2002 already had a taste of what it was like to make decisions about their lives and decide how things were. And all those community radio stations that couldn't be closed down, they broadcast to the entire city of Caracas that somebody has kidnapped our president. And what happened was, hundreds of thousands of people surrounded Miraflores. And the army went to Miraflores and said, this isn't going to happen. All those people that conducted the coup ran away. Chavez came back. We had another, the coup was turned over, in other words. Again, that didn't stop the opposition. That opposition continued through sabotage, through hoarding, through speculation, and then most recently, in the last year, the United States under Obama, actually, Obama declared that Venezuela was a threat to the national security of the United States. Obama sanctioned 7 people in Venezuela. Since then, there has been, and I'm not going to go through all of that at this point, but since then, National Endowment for Democracy, NED, USAID, both the Republican and Democratic institutes of spreading foreign democracy have supplied millions, tens of millions of dollars to the opposition. NED, you can go to their website, the National Endowment for Democracy. You can find out every country that they give money to, and you can find out how much money they had given. I'm assuming it's still there, but up until 2018, they had given $20 million. In the last month, The U.S. government gave $52 million to a man named Juan Guaido. The USAID gave $42 million to the opposition parties in Venezuela. There's real concern about the Russians interfering in the elections in the U.S. because they have some blogs or they have some Facebook signs, right? What kind of intervention is it when you give $52 million to a man that declared himself president without ever being elected to that office? What kind of intervention is it when you give $42 million for the avowed purpose of removing the elected president of that country? I want to end a little bit by talking about how the media framed this. The media framed this, and I think fake news isn't so much as important as the absent news, the things that are not reported. The media reports on Venezuela by focusing on the bus driver that's now president of the country. The media focus on Venezuela by selectively deciding that there is a crisis and a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. That's true. But one of the reasons there's a crisis is because of the huge fall in oil prices, the United States sanctions that began and then became a blockade and then became a boycott, so that Venezuela that had the money could not buy drugs for malaria or what do you call it when your kidneys aren't, for dialysis machines. They could not buy the money that they needed for the food. They could not buy the money, buy the goods, even though they had the money. The United States decided that Citgo, which is partially owned and sells the Venezuelan oil in the United States, was no longer able to take any money out of U.S. banks. So all the money that had been sold through Citgo that belongs to Venezuela, the United States said that's not yours anymore. They termed the election a sham. 2018 election was a sham, despite the fact that there were more than 300 international observers that said that there was no problem with this election. I would also say, despite the fact that the man that they recognized as the new president was elected under that same election. Maduro's elected, that's a sham election. Guaido's elected, yes, he represents the people. How did he become president? There is nothing in the Constitution that says he should become president. It says when the president is incapacitated or unable to serve, then the vice president will serve, and then the vice president has to call elections within, I think it's 30 days. Neither of those things happened. Guaido is the president of National Assembly. How did he become president of National Assembly? The last election, he got about 20% of the vote to be elected a deputy. Why did he become the president of the National Assembly? The National Assembly has an agreement between the three opposition parties that they will rotate the presidency. So it became the turn for the party that Guaido is a member of, and so they should be president. But Leopoldo Lopez, who was the head of that party, was in prison for violating laws. He's fled now, him and his wife. The second man had already fled because he was under indictment. That left Guaido. Nobody knew who the hell Guaido was. It's kind of like the person that declared themselves president in Bolivia a few days ago. Nobody heard of this evangelical legislature that says indigenous should go back to the mountains. But she declared herself president, the same thing. Okay, it's a sham election, but it's not a sham election if the people we support get elected. It's only a sham election if the people we don't want elected are elected. Remember, this is the same electoral system that put the people in National Assembly in their seats. So you say these seats are valid, but his isn't. That's hypocrisy at its greatest. But you don't get, you read that in the newspaper. Instead, you'll read 15 international countries recognize Juan Guaido. I'd ask you to think about that for a minute. 50 countries, what does that mean? 140 countries don't recognize Guaido. The United Nations General Assembly doesn't recognize Guaido. Elections only count if the people that you want are elected. So Maduro becomes a dictator in the newspaper. Maduro becomes responsible for the collapse of the economy, the collapse, right? Socialism couldn't work in Venezuela. No system works if you can't trade, if you can't buy goods, if you can't produce and distribute. You don't see things on the front page about Macron in France. His rating is below 20%. The police are beating thousands of protesters. They have been for more than 12 weeks. More than 300 people have been assassinated in Colombia. Elizabeth might be able to tell you, but you don't see that on the front page of the newspaper. It's a choice. It's a choice. And what the U.S. is doing is a violation of international law. The United Nations rapporteur for Venezuela that was there that investigated said that the sanctions by the United States against Venezuela are a violation of international law and they should be brought before the International Court on Human Rights. That was the UN representative that went to Venezuela in 2018. This was his conclusion. And then when the U.S. says, well, there's people starving, humanitarian aid needs to come, and all the people that are social justice people in Loyola said, yes, let's feed the people, let's send them stuff, right? Well, explain to me why the Catholic Church, the United Nations, and the Red Cross said, we won't participate in that. They said they won't participate in it because they said it was a political weapon that was being used for political purposes, that it had little to do with humanitarian aid. That's not reported in the New York Times or Chicago Tribune. Nor is it reported that the Red Cross was actually distributing food in Venezuela when Guaido and his friends were bringing the little trucks to the border in Colombia. There was already humanitarian aid being distributed. Instead, the headlines say, Venezuelan government is trying to stop humanitarian aid to Venezuela. So I'd say two things. On the one hand, here was an experiment, an opportunity to see what happens when there's democracy, where the population can actually participate and make its decisions. And for that reason alone, it should be supported and defended. The second thing I should say, it's dangerous. It's dangerous, the response of the United States, the UK, Canada, and the rest, to allow that to happen, because it's a template. It's a template. What do you do? I can perhaps find. USAID says the goal in Venezuela was, the objective was, you could find thousands of youth, high school and college kids that went to private universities that were horrified of this Indian-looking guy. They were idealistic. They wanted to help them build a civic organization so they could mobilize and organize. They were afraid of Chavez because he was Pardo in the common language, which is, he's black, he's indigenous, doesn't belong as president, and certainly a bus driver doesn't belong as president. What John Bolton says is, we want to make them scream. We want to make them scream. The United States State Department, in their documents, which are public documents, and I'd be happy to share it with you, said the same thing. One of the best bullets is sanctions. One of the best bullets is economic warfare. You make it impossible for the society to exist by squeezing it economically. I would say that's, and it's not far-fetched to say that, because I would say that's what's happened in Bolivia in the last couple weeks. That's exactly the scenario that played out. That's what's happening in Peru. That's what's happening in many of the countries. But you, again, you will not see in the U.S. press the fact that the president of Peru has suspended the Constitution and said that there will be no demonstrations for the next 60 days. You will not see in the headlines of the New York Times. It was in the New York Times yesterday, page 14 or something, a small thing about Bolivia. But it said, after the president stepped down, there were protests, and the police, to try to keep order, has fired on people. But it's not blaring on the front page or in the international section that there is a crackdown on free speech or democratic rights. I would say we can look at what's happening in Bolivia and what the new self-declared president said is going to happen, which means they said that they will open up mineral deposits, iridium, lithium. You all have a phone. What's it have to do with you? Largest iridium Indian deposits in the world are in Bolivia. Under the Morales government, under MAS, under the Constitution, that belonged to the Bolivians. Under the new president, this will be sold to a Canadian company, a Canadian mining company. One of the women that was at a demonstration a few weeks ago, it might have even been the 16th of November when Guaido said that there would be another. Guaido called on the military to remove Maduro just like they had done with Morales in Bolivia. He called for demonstrations. Nothing happened because that's not where the population is. Very small. Talk about fake news. Mark Rubio said, look at all the people protesting the government. And he posted a thing that showed this big demonstration in the streets. But somebody noted that was a demonstration that happened a year ago. It wasn't this. He isn't exposed for fake news. It's just left. I'm saying this because one of the women that was at the demonstrations in defense of the Constitution, in defense of the Chavista gains, in defense of Maduro in the election said, if this government falls, we will be evicted. We, the black, the poor, the working class, will lose what we have. That's what's at stake. If you're in favor of social justice, I would argue there is nothing less important that we can do now than to say U.S. out of Venezuela, U.S. out of Latin America, hands off Venezuela, and learn from the project that has been taking place for 15 years and is now under the stranglehold of U.S. sanctions, U.S. blockade, and direct U.S. intervention with the financing of opposition groups in Venezuela. I have a list here of some of the things over the last 15 years that you can take. Some of the things are cited. Other things, if you want, there's a better email for me than the one on there. My email is artz, A-R-T-Z, at Purdue.edu.
Thank you.
Oh, no.
I'll take questions.
Yep.
Goes back to
So what
because I thought there was like
Dr.
5.
Artz presented
There's
us
only
with
5.
a huge amount. What are you leaving? What I it's embarrassing. Okay, so what we are going to do now is, like I said before, invite you to get into groups of 2 or 3. And again, Dr. Artz presented us with a huge amount of information. So discuss. There are a lot of questions I think that we could ask that we don't have, unfortunately, as much time as it would be ideal. So, but by all means, I think it's very important for you to have the opportunity to talk to your neighbors and identify some areas of concern and interest that you would like to raise. And those that you cannot raise, please, I invite you to write about them on your files. So let's go. I invite George to join us if he wants to. All right, Val, spill it. In the name of the millions of Venezuelans.
Is that like the time? Like for 4 of the US every single car?
The only thing I should say is check on your phone.
Is that what was happening? Like
Until 20th.
I have neighbors.
that's when like the US hot dog and that's when like
Well,
the
all
president,
right, George, join us.
after the president was taken, kidnapped, and then he came back, and the other day was brought to, but he wasn't
Let's take a shot because there were a lot of things being said here, right? So when you say que coño fue eso, which is the part that you're talking about?
Just trying to, but like this is what I get. He said something about the CIA, like how we got this information from the CIA about how like the poverty line, like percentage of people in Venezuela is like from 50 to 25% under this guy's rule. Right, but what medium did we find it on? That's what I don't understand. Like it's still have to find the resources. I know, but like on what medium? Like where did we get that information? Like it has to be somewhere. It has to be at some medium. And then it's not
really like specific statistics on the amount of like
that are entering Colombia and Ecuador and seeking refuge if there is any problem.
why
Mexican newspapers.
I don't get that either. Wait, I'm pretty sure.
This is little not just the media being insane and creating a narrative if this is happening. If poverty reduced to 54%, infant rate mortality has not sexual and average.
Oh, I just put, yeah, Obama declared Venezuela as a threat. That's all it was.
I wrote that. I said, apparently Venezuela is not safe.
Wait, so Forbes is like weekly that's run by like that's run thing, and that's like in a capitalistic nation. So why would a capitalistic like based or like organization be supporting? Yes. Like that doesn't make any sense. Like how does that make sense? That's like the opposite.
No, but that's just like
What the fudge? That blew my mind.
I think the thing that like with Obama specifically is that like there are still a lot of Democrats who are anti-imperialist, and I think that was like one of the biggest criticisms that he got from people who was like more socialist and left. And I think that's what he was kind of talking about. If there's that
I don't know either. That was just nice.
it would make sense.
Yeah.
food trucks were delivered.
Isn't there a lot of oil that comes from Israel, right? Am I wrong? There's a lot of oil, right? No. Not just because he said something about Israel and the United States supporting the like declaring Venezuela as a threat. If I remember correctly. Do you know what I'm saying?
I think Venezuela.
My mind is like really I was like really focused. What were you gonna say?
I don't know. I forgot what I was going to say, sorry.
Fine.
About oil, but I forgot. I was just like... But I think Venezuela has like the most natural oil reserves in the world right now, right? That could be made up, but possibly.
Yeah,
Probably made up, I don't know.
But yeah, you said that. We don't know. You're not there.
That's an interesting point, kind of like philosophically.
So you.
And you said something about that. Everything you know is wrong. I wrote that down. Okay. How do you
We should come up with like some questions to ask.
I think the one about the CIA, what medium, these are just my thoughts, we don't have to go to this at all. Like what medium do you find this information on? Like if it's not mainstream, where do you find it? And then like why is a capitalistic organization like Forbes supporting a socialist community? Like why, like that's like...
You presented that like it was out of business.
Yeah, exactly.
Like indicating that
But why was it? It's very it's contradicting our whole economic system. I don't know why I'm so fired up right now. like I'm really confused. No, because I can talk in small group, but not. I get too nervous.
As far as the CIA goes, there might be like unclassified documents that have become unclassified later, like several years after they wouldn't have been reported on, or maybe just because the bent of mainstream media isn't to focus on them.
Yeah.
But as far as the source, that could be part of it.
No, that's
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was thinking
Oh, I thought you were gonna say, I thought you took a breath. When he said the thing about giving, like, Obama or the United States giving Venezuela $20 million, what was, like, is that to maintain democracy? Like the democracy, or like not the non-socialist democracy?
That was given to the
Honestly, I think that he's very set in his ways.
Yeah.
If I were to raise my
Yes. Okay. That's what I thought, but I just wanted to.
no, I know.
It's true, like, you know. Val was fired up. I was on her the entire thing.
All right, we have 5 minutes and the possibility of a lot of questions coming from you. So because we have so little time and I think there are a lot of questions, I would like to hear a variety of questions and invite Dr. Artz to address them. So let's go around the room and hear your questions. And let's start wherever we want to start. Oh, okay, Brenda has a question.
I was curious what you think. So like, I think like it's pretty known that like the United States, like although like we're talking about Venezuela, they involve themselves in a lot of countries, developing countries as they're trying to develop their own political like identity. And what do you think the United States like biggest motivation for that is? Like I talked about how like it might be like their agenda of not letting socialism succeed in any other country so that they can argue that it won't succeed here, or in order to achieve like capitalistic gains as a country. But I was curious what you thought like their like reason for getting involved in other countries' politics.
Cool. Let's hear a couple of other questions. Over here. Yes, thank you. I'm glad that you asked Mary first. So yes, that sounds very good.
I was coerced into
Mary
it.
approved, so that's good.
We were wondering specifically about what you were saying about Forbes sort of supporting socialism, how that seems contradictory to the society that we live in. Why did that occur, and what do you think that says about publications in America?
All right, other questions? Thank you. Over here. Val, you had like about 10 questions.
Okay, this will take about 40 seconds to address. Okay, well, first of all, I don't understand where all this information is coming from. I'm a little bit of background about me. I'm from Ecuador, so we have also been liberated from a similar political ideology, such as Rafael Correa, who also left our country in massive debt. But we have the US dollar and we have other influences that didn't leave us, like Venezuela. I noticed that you used Eugenio Martinez to kind of back up the information that you were giving. I don't know who Eugenio Martinez is and what his role or political affiliation is in The Economist, so I would kind of like to know a background on that. How much of the oil profits are allocated towards education, because the last time I checked was that La Universidad Central de Caracas has zero resources, and also their students are constantly striking, they're constantly censored, and they have no choice but to abandon the city, abandon their studies, and move to other countries such as my own in order to follow and actually make something out of their lives. I was also looking towards why are there 7,000 Venezuelans a week entering into my country, Ecuador, or entering other South American countries such as Peru, who's actually doing very well in comparison of their neighboring countries. Why are they leaving? In that case, and also protesting against the government every single time they have a chance. There's a Mexican newspaper that, if we notice, Mexico at this moment protects and defends Maduro, so they're biased towards it, but yet they stated that $786 million was going to go from the UN to the 3 million Venezuelans that were leaving. So it was to fund the countries that are accepting Venezuelans due to the economic crisis. Also, I noticed that you said about poverty reducing to 74%, or reduce 74%. I don't understand how that is the case at this moment, but I would like you to kind of expand on how you think that Venezuela is doing better in poverty rates. Infant rate is actually not, infant mortality rate is not actually doing better. It's going from 0 to 3 years old for the children that are living in impoverished homes. And also, I noticed that you attack the media for portraying this narrative on Maduro. They don't, in my understanding, in my personal opinion, people don't attack Maduro because he's a bus driver. They attack him because of the massive genocide, censorship, killings that he does, forcing the military to go against their own countrymen, and because there is massive hunger everywhere. And if this wasn't the case, I don't think the media would have even cared about a South American country. Aside from the, but that isn't. Thank you.
And you have 2 minutes.
Most of what she says about conditions in Venezuela today is absolutely right.
Yes.
That's not a question.
That's not a question.
Poverty's increased. Food shortages. Yes. Problems with the electrical grid. All that's true. But I didn't talk to you about now. I talked to you about what happened before the U.S. sanctions began. What happens after the U.S. sanctions begin? If you make an oil, and I worked in an oil refinery for many years before I was a steel worker before I became a college professor. That's a different story. If you have an oil rig and you're pumping oil and there's a part on the oil rig that breaks, what do you do? Seriously, what do you do?
You fix it.
What?
Stop pumping the oil.
If you have a ballpoint pen and it runs out of ink, do you say, well, I can't write anymore? What do you do?
Add one.
And where do you get a new one?
The store.
A friend. Before you try to remember it.
Okay, so if I have an oil rig and I've got a camshaft that's made for that oil rig, what do I do? Go down to the store and buy one? They're right next to the Big Pens. Big Pens, oil rig repair parts. What do? You buy it. Where do you buy it?
Whatever country or company it's
And if you want to buy it from that country, whether it's Brazil or UK or whatever, and they won't sell it to you, what do?
You go to the next country.
And that country won't sell it to you.
You go to the next country.
And no country will sell it to you, except you stop producing.
I would say black market.
I mean, maybe it's my machinist background, but you have parts that fit into other parts. You can't just put something in there that doesn't fit. It's made to produce oil, to dig oil out of the ground, to pump it up, to filter it, to refine it. And if there's a missing component, you have to replace or repair that missing component. And if you aren't making those components in your country, or you aren't making enough of those in your country, you have to buy it internationally. And you buy it internationally because you have reserves. But what if the bank in the UK says, the $1.2 billion of gold you have that belongs to you? Nope, it's not yours. We're keeping it. What if you have $7 billion of money that belongs to Citgo, and the U.S. says, nope, you can't have it? You have two problems. One is you can't buy things because other countries are afraid of U.S. sanctions and the blockade. And two, the money that you've been using in the past is not available to you anymore. What if I took all your bank accounts and said, I saw that you cheated on Miss Lozano's test last week, and that was not good. And so your bank accounts are frozen. In fact, I'm giving her your money. And any money you make in the future belongs to her. That's exactly what has happened in Venezuela. Oil prices collapsed, partly because of U.S. fracking, partly because of Saudi Arabia flooding the market. If you want to compare a country, compare Venezuela to Nigeria. The same population, the same basic resource, and talk about poverty and death and malnutrition and illiteracy. If you want to compare Venezuela to now, and everything you said is absolutely right. And the question is, why did that happen?
Because Chavez was a war criminal. That's why nobody wanted to make business.
The U.S. sanctions happened. The U.S. sanctions happened. The United Nations gave Venezuela the award for literacy. The United Nations FAO gave Venezuela the award for health and nutrition.
Why were there sanctions imposed? What was the rationale?
Well, Obama says it was a threat to the national security of the United States. It goes to his question, what's the motivation of the U.S.? And it's not so much socialism.
So why did he declare the threat?
Because it is a threat of a good example. Can you imagine in West Chicago, right here, that in West Chicago, in the next 3 years, they built 5 new schools. They have 3 new health clinics. They have 2 local radio stations.
Weren't the Cubans taking over the military and the internal defense of Venezuela at the time?
No. No.
So what were the stated reasons that Obama put sanctions on?
He didn't have to give stated reasons. It was an executive order. He didn't have stated reasons. He said it was a threat to U.S. security.
Well,
in 2015.
Even Trump, when he makes his executive orders, gives valid reasons.
Gives valid reasons, did you say?
Well, he gives reasons.
I'm just asking.
Uh-oh, on that note. All right, on your blogs, I am going to invite you to finish your blog with a question or 2, and I'm going to send those questions to Dr. Artz to continue this back and forth, because 50 minutes is never enough.
Just quickly, I did not say Forbes was in favor of socialism. I said Forbes is not a socialist journal. It's Forbes, the capitalist, whatever it's called, said that the election process in Venezuela was a model for democratic elections.
Yeah, he was saying the
my
opposite. That
point
it's
was
not
that
a socialist.
Forbes was saying that, not me and not Cuba, but Forbes.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.